Okay, in this presentation here, I'm going to explain to you the basics of how to do a research design. Uh, and this is intended to fit any of my courses in which the final project is a research design. So I'm going to try to avoid any course-specific references. Look inside your Canvas shell to find out what the particulars of the assignment are. But generally, I'm just going to say, write a research design. What do I mean by that? Well, here we go. Now, of course, I'm going to take the long way to do this because, Professor, scientific inquiry has to have some kind of empirical component. And, this is a theorist saying this to you, but because we've got to at some point test out whether what we think about the world is actually true. Because a lot of people have ideas and you look at the world and you say, well, I think this is what's going on. And that's an inference, right? And if you're trying to explain why something's occurring, it's explanatory. If you think there's something going on, like maybe you think democracy is receding in the world, that can be descriptive, right? Is democracy really receding in the world? Are we better or worse off than people used to be? Those can be descriptive questions, right? Where you're looking at that, and usually we start in science. We have an annoying habit of stating a hypothesis that the question, are we better off than we used to be, or is the world safer than it was during the Cold War? Those are often expressed as, well, here's a hypothesis: the world is safer, or we are better off. That becomes the inference, and then we test it. And all of this, I think, though, one of my professors summed up the approach he wanted us to take and was pushing us to take. And he says, look, when we utter a sentence about reality, we do something to prove it's right. Now, of course, we don't actually in science prove anything's right. We actually falsify hypotheses, but that's the gist of it. So with a research design, you're explaining how you're going to do this with regard to some topic you've chosen. Let's go into how that process plays out a little more. Okay, our standards, before we do that, our standards here are for scientific inquiry are interest. The topic has to be interesting. It should not be trivial. And in general, there's if you can make something generalizable, right? You may be looking at Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, but you might want to say, well, let's talk about it in terms of populism in South America, right? And so if we can generalize the topic, that's usually good. But it has to be some aspect of IR that's not trivial. So interest is something that is, has to be interesting. The other standard of research that we're going to judge research on is cumulation. Research has to build on previous scholarly work. We do not reinvent the wheel. We want to make sure that we are standing on the shoulders of people who went before. So using other people's ideas and using their research as part of yours is perfectly okay as long as you attribute it, right? We want you to look at what other people did and use their ideas if they had a good way of thinking about the world or if they had a good method for testing something. By all means, just make clear what's yours and what's theirs. So accumulation, standing on the shoulders of others, but originality is important. Research must go beyond previous scholarly work. You've got to do something interesting, well, original, right? And it doesn't have to be earth-shaking, but a lot of people freak out when they hear this. How can I do something no one else has done? Yeah, you apply a technique someone used to study Hugo Chavez, to study a populist movement in Europe or in Turkey, say, Erdogan in Turkey. I mean, it is not that hard to be original. Finally, we have to have a method. research must employ some sort of scholarly method. Now, what do I mean by that? The standards for a method or methodology is that it has to be empirical, meaning we're looking at data from the world. It has to be systematic, and this is very important. It's going to follow steps. There's a sequence to it, right? And so we can say this is what we're doing, and each way. And so it's thought out. It's not haphazard. It's not casual observation of the world, right? It's in some way organized. And this leads into it being transparent or reproducible. That is to say, the steps that are taken are fully described so others can follow them. And thus, it is potentially reproducible, right? We can look at what you did and follow the steps and we could do it ourselves. And you might not actually do it, but at least we can follow the steps of the argument. We know this is like showing your work on a math problem, right? We know where the answer's coming from. So we're not dependent on the judgments of the researcher. We can look at it and evaluate it ourselves. That's, the big thing about transparency and reproducibility. And this last one is, it should be persuasive. The end result should provide, some support for the conclusion. We should have some kind of sense that, yeah, what you looked at and what you found is persuasive, right? And that is to say that there's some validity to your findings, right? And you want to make sure that the data, that very often your data is very specific and you're looking at a stylized part of the world, and there's usually some leap to the more general topic that you're looking for, that you're going to want to, leverage off of your empirical findings to make some conclusion about the world. And this has to be, persuasive. We have to say, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying here. That makes sense. But worry about very much the first ones here. Those are the clear ones that you want to worry about. Now, I say you want to worry about it. What do I mean? Now, you're writing a research design, but a research design is a design of the research, is part of the research process. And so what is the whole process that the design would be part of? And I break up the research process into 3 stages. There's a preliminary stage where you identify and research your topic to develop a research question, right? I'm very big on this, that it takes research to start doing research. And so in your preliminary stage, you're saying, all right, I want to do my paper on this topic, right? I want to look at populism in Venezuela, and all right, you're interested. Now you have to read what people have written about that to come down to, well, what exactly are you going to look at, and how are you going to do that, right? And so you've got to, move into developing your research question, which is really part of the preparatory stage, right? In the preparatory stage, you develop the research design. You figure out, all right, based on, this is the question. In the preliminary stage, I've identified the question, right? Did Hugo Chavez's reforms really help people? To what extent, this might be a thing, is to what extent did they help the population? Or maybe you focus in on, hey, a lot of people talk about Hugo Chavez is, about them causing all his policies causing economic problems. You might say, well, how bad off would Venezuela have been just from a price collapse if it hadn't followed those policies? I mean, how much would it have just been screwed by the drop in oil prices anyway? Because no one's looked at this, right? That becomes your question, right? You focus down from a general topic to a question. And then with that question in the preparatory stage, you say, well, how the heck am I going to do that? And this is where you develop the plan to answer the question you've identified in the preliminary stage. So you write your research design, which is what this is about. Then, in the research stage, you conduct the research, draw conclusions, write the paper. You basically follow the research design. So obviously, to do a research design, you're going to go through the first two stages of research, the preliminary stage and the preparatory stage. Now, the preliminary stage, you determine your interest. You say, I am going to do my paper on, right? And that's you. You're interested in it. You have to be interested in a topic to write a paper on it. So your interest is very important. What are you really interested in? That comes from you. Once you've got an idea, then you survey the literature, right? You surf journals online. This is the key thing. You want scholarly journal articles from our databases like JSTOR, because they look at questions and they define things in ways that are helpful to you. They lay out their methods, and they reference all these other people. So from one article on your topic, you can identify several articles or books even on that same topic, and so you can spread out, right, and look for more sources. You're interested, as you're looking through these things, you're interested in how the authors are breaking up issues, how they're looking at the things involved. You're interested in how people have defined key concepts like populism. If you're doing the Hugo Chavez thing, if you're doing democracy, it's how they define democracy, development, growth, the human security, whatever your issues are. Usually there are definitions and a vocabulary of different terms that are used by these authors. So you want to get a sense of that. You want to look at, very importantly, what questions have people asked on this topic and how have they posed them? How have they typically looked at it? What's been done? How have they been looking at things? And you want to also say, what answers have people provided to the questions? What have they already found out, right? And so, because you're not going to reproduce that, right? You've got to be original. So you're looking at that when you're surveying the literature, and you're also critically looking at what haven't they answered, or all right, here are all the answers they provided. I don't know what bothers you about it. What's missing here? Because that's where you're going to go. You're trying to find the gap or the unresolved question, or it might be a dispute, or someplace they haven't applied this or haven't looked at, right? They haven't applied their methods, or they haven't looked at something. You're looking for, that's the other thing you're doing, is looking for the hole in it. And that's what you want to do. You want to focus on some particular aspect of the topic. Always better to be narrow and deep than broad and shallow. And you're trying to find something that no one's done before. For you, key thing, you always have to identify and get clear in your head independent variables or different variables. And there's two. There's an independent and dependent variable. We talk about these things. The dependent variable is the thing you're trying to explain. And especially if you're looking at some kind of causal relationship, what are you trying to explain? Independent variables are things that are thought to have an effect on the dependent variable, right? So in realist theory, their dependent variable is the occurrence of war, and their primary independent variable is the balance of power. If you're making an explanation of the world, you're explaining how a dependent variable, this is the thing you're trying to explain, is affected by other things, in other words, the independent variable. And I say that it's always very important for you to be clear about what your dependent variable is. What is the thing you're trying to explain? And because sometimes cause and effect can get tangled and turned around, and so you have to be very clear on that. Okay. Once you've done that research, you move into the preparatory stage, where first you develop the question in a serious way, right? So you say, all right, this is the aspect of the problem I'm interested in. Let's define the concepts. Think about what's at play here. What are we trying to understand? And you're going to have to do some conceptual work here. Very often you're going to, feel free to take definitions or ways things are defined from the literature. That's accumulation. Just attribute it, right? And you're going to want to pose the question in a way that it can be answered. For instance, did Hugo Chavez's policies ruin the economy of Venezuela? Well, that's a kind of open-ended question. Let me pose it this way. How bad would they have been if they'd followed policies of other countries, and after the oil takedown, right? So say, how much would the oil price drops have hurt anyway, and what percentage of their problems can be attributed to that, right? That's posing it in a way that's more empirical and that it can be answered, right? So you're trying to take your question and express it in terms of a more fact-based empirical kind of measuring, which is longer or shorter, right? And you want to consider possible answers or alternatives here. Then you design, the research, and you say, okay, how am I going to find and test these answers, right? And what will be my standards for success or failure? What am I going to explain? And so, I'm kind of stuck with this one example, but one of your, if you're looking at this of saying, well, how am I going to figure out how much their policies screwed the country? You might say, well, I'm going to find out how much the oil price cut would have diminished the growth in the economy, and then say, all right, I'll take that out of the actual fall in GDP or whatever, and I'll do it as a percentage, and then I'll just say, okay, this is some indicator of what percentage of their current problems would, what percentage of GDP loss would have happened anyway, and then we can look at that and say this is where they are. And that's setting the standard. That's identifying a metric or a way of evaluating the answer. I hope that makes some sense. You're also going to operationalize variables. This is where, if you're going to measure democracy, if you're going to measure GDP, if you're going to measure corruption, you're going to define, and when you operationalize a variable, you're taking its substantive meaning, what you mean when you talk about corruption or democracy or freedom, or economic freedom, and then you have to operationalize it, right? You have to then say, okay, how are we going to measure it? And so you bring it into some concrete measurable thing, right? And that's operationalizing it. And all the things I mentioned, again, you don't have to do this all on your own. There are indexes of democracy from Freedom House and the Economist Intelligence Unit, Heritage Foundation, even though it's become very partisan, nevertheless has produced an index of economic freedom. So there are already, people maybe have already done that. And so, okay, there you go. You may have other concepts that you will want to operationalize. And so the key thing is what you mean by the word, what you mean by the term, lay it out, and then how you can measure that. That's operationalization. And again, very often you're going to get this from the literature. But if you've got something weird, in the research design, that's where you do the conceptual heavy lifting and explain what you mean and how you're going to measure it. Then you identify data and outline the steps in the argument. Now, all of that right there, you could stop, right? Basically, that's what a research design is. Okay, you're going to do all that, and write it up. Okay. Now, I've got a little more about the different, when I talk about how you're going to do it, there are a couple things to consider. So we're going to get a little bit more into some issues of method here. That is to say, there are different types of studies. A descriptive study, you describe what's going on. And so, do we have a retreat from democracy? Is poverty being, reduced? Is income inequality growing in the world? Those are descriptive studies or descriptive questions. Then there's relational, where you look at two different variables, where you say, hey, how are these two things doing? How is development going in different regions, right? And so do we see a regional relationship? Are some regions like Asia consistently doing better than Latin America or Africa? And so you can look at those two things. And you're kind of looking at, you're introducing a sort of an independent variable. You're introducing a category, and you're going to compare the categories without making a causal inference, because that's the last thing we got, which is a causal study, where you want to say, hey, is there, are we seeing a relationship, a causal relationship between two different things, right? Does trade liberalization produce increases in economic growth within a nation? And, in the slide, I've got this idea more from domestic politics. We could be descriptive, opinion polls, say, all right, how much, what's the president's job approval? What candidate are people going to vote for? The horse race polls that you see in an election. In a relational study, we could compare, categories. How are men voting? How are women voting? We could break it up, all the different categories, right? In a causal thing, we're trying to determine, hey, is something having an effect? Is there a relationship? And so in a causal study, we try to figure out whether a campaign or an event in a campaign actually had an effect. Did Comey announcing the reopening of the email investigation, did that actually affect the election, or was the election already headed in that way anyway? Cause and effect. So these are the different types of studies, and you've got to figure out what you're going to do. What type answers the question you want. There's two styles of research. Quantitative research, where we're going to use numerical measurements of specific, well-defined, and limited variables, limited in number. And so we're going to have measurements, and in order to have measurements, things need to be well-defined. Now, sometimes they're not simple concepts, democracy, corruption, but we have indexes that have pretty much figured out how to measure them. And we're going to look at maybe the relationship of corruption to economic growth in a country. And we're only going to be looking at a few variables. It's going to be a very limited number. But this method lets us test hypotheses and provide general conclusions, because we can look at corruption versus economic growth in dozens or every country for which there's data. And so we can look at what we call large N. N is the number of observations you've got. We can have kind of a large N study going. Qualitative is more like case studies, and are the primary example here. And we're not going to depend on numerical measurements, and we're not going to limit ourselves to just a few variables that are, we're not going to worry about. They're not going to be as defined. They're not going to be boiled down to a number, 5 out of 10, right? The idea here is there's more context, right? We can get a lot more context, and we can look at a a large amount of info in context. Unfortunately, you got to look at a large amount of info in context. They're not easy to do, even though people sometimes feel more comfortable doing them. But we can look at these things, and very often we can find variables, and we can get a better sense for the variables involved. Maybe the variable going in isn't as obvious as until after you've conducted your analysis of the case or cases. And very often case studies will result in a suggestion that this is a variable we should look at in a more quantitative way. And they're not as well defined going in. And so qualitative studies are important, but they do a very different thing. They're very often used when you don't have a developed literature that has said, hey, this is what's really important for economic growth. Democracy, foreign direct investment, education, we've got a whole number of variables that are easily defined and identified. Sometimes it's a newer phenomena, and you're trying to look at, okay, it's a populist movement rolling through Europe and the world. What's that effect? Well, this is kind of new, and the definitions aren't as concrete for the different, and the list of variables is not set, and we don't. It could be broad. Let's work on identifying variables and limiting them to things that we think are important, and that's what you would do in a qualitative study. Okay. So those are the types of studies. Now, there's a lot more on it, but this is not a research methods course. But here we go. So what does the design look like? I can't give you a cookie cutter. If you want to, people always say, can you give me an example of a research design? Well, no, because they're not finished products. They're things that people do. They may not formally do them. They might have notes, but people don't publish research designs. They publish research papers. Now, however, most of what's in the design is in the first few sections of a paper. And so if you want an example of a research design, there's find a few empirical papers and note. They'll have an intro. They'll talk about the topic. They'll explain its relevance. They'll then survey the literature. They'll talk about what's been done and hasn't been done. And then they will have a section on methodology that says how they're going to answer the question, and they're going to define variables. And bam, that's the research design. Okay? That's like the first part of the paper is the research design. And so that gives you kind of an example. That's where your example is. And often it helps to think, well, I'm writing the first part of the paper, right? The first third of the paper or whatever. And just here's a basic thing, introduction, some introductory part where you're going to introduce a topic, you're going to have a literature review, and you're going to define the research question. And that could be several sections on their own, right? And in fact, that'll be about half the research design right there. But it's called the introduction because this would be the introduction of the final paper. And then a section on methodology where you're going to define and operationalize all the variables, explain the methodology to be employed, and then lay out the steps taken in doing so and identify where your data is going to come from, right? And so that would be the research design. That's what, the finished product would look something like this. General comments about a research process, and that's it's relevant to this as well because this is the first part of it. Selecting a topic, framing the question is half the battle, so it takes half the time. A research design is not slapped together. It is not trivial to your process. It takes research to properly ask the question. You can't just say, all right, I'm interested in this topic, and boom, I'm ready to go. If no, you have to read the crap that other people have worked on, and it ain't hopefully not crap. Hopefully it's very good with a crappy section that you can improve upon. But the point is, it takes this research, it takes reading, and that's what's involved in doing the research design. And it's a good assignment for a course because along the way, you get really knowledgeable about the general topic, right? But you then say, all right, what can we do? You're focused not only on learning what other people are done, but saying, okay, what could we do to go a little farther? Your core, the assignments in the course can be part of this, right? That's always, you're going to be doing a research design on a topic in the course. There are a lot of things, and you should, feel free to take advantage of opportunities when your assignment fits. You're gaining a lot through that, right? And so that's a big part of your research. It doesn't have to be completely exclusive. And the key thing is the question you ask is going to determine the shape of your research. Are you doing, are you going to do a qualitative study or a quantitative study? Are you doing a descriptive, relational, causal study? Well, that depends on the question, right? So figuring out the question is really huge, right? And then everything should follow from that. In fact, I'll grade the research design about whether that all fits together, right? Are you doing something? Are you looking to do research in a way that's appropriate to the question that you've identified? And so, good research analysis requires structure and focus. That's why you do a research design before you do it, and kind of why I'm having you focus on this, because a lot of people will start taking the capstone option where you'll have to write a paper, and in 6 weeks you've got to write this paper. Well, if you have a research design or you've done research designs, this will help you understand what the structure should be and how to focus, right? Also, by the way, a big thing that you can find out here is you can get a theoretical structure. It's very good to have a strong theoretical point of view, or to be testing a theoretical point of view, because the theories tell you what data is important and what isn't. And they really, you can be overwhelmed by data. When you have a theory tells you, all right, this is the data you need. This is what's important, and that's what isn't important, or everything else is not important. And so it really is a big help in doing things. So, if you're very theoretical, if you're looking at, that's why the conceptual portion of the research design, where maybe you're looking at different theories and picking one or finding a way to compare them, that's very helpful in terms of ensuring some long-range success, because it will simplify your data gathering. It may send you looking for something particularly hard, but it is allowing you to sift through just the tons of data that exists out there in the world. Okay, if you have any questions about this, obviously you should contact me. This has all been done with the point of view that you're going to write a research design in one of my courses. Questions about what's appropriate and what you should do, should be directed to me. And keep in mind the general things I'm going to tell you. What are you interested in? Have you done research? Have you done searches? I want you to do that stuff before you ask questions. But questions about, is this topic a valid one, are usually, yeah, let's nail that puppy down. You definitely want to, if you're not sure, ask. More often than not, I say okay, or I say, well, why don't you go in this direction? So you really, do ask. You're as likely to get a green light as a red light. And otherwise, good luck with all this.